folks, and welcome to our performance of this afternoon. We are the Tredegar Brass Band, and what we are is a group of musicians who have an interest in history and old music, and in this particular case, we'll be playing music directly from the band books of the Civil War military bands. At the time of the Civil War, the idea of brass band music was fairly new, still. There had been some brass bands in the Boston area, but the instruments were very hard to come by. And the military knew that the brass band would be something that would entertain the troops and instill the fight in the men. Hey, we'll get around that. You just simmer down over there.
I want to hear I'm a good old rebel.
Okay, you'll give me get I'm a good old rebel in a minute. We're getting there. So anyway, what kind of welcome is this for Victoria? We come here all the way from Richmond, and this is the best we get, huh? So you can imagine, at the beginning of the war, there were probably a lot of people, scallywags, musicians that...
We call those the good old days.
Now we call them musicians that were out of work, probably guitar players, and who were causing trouble. And anyway, people were looking for work. They didn't necessarily want to carry a gun at the start of the war, so a lot of musicians joined up.
Wait a minute. And who didn't want to carry a gun at the start of the war? The guitar players.
Guitar players. You missed the other part. Yeah. Anyway, recruitment was so successful at the beginning of the war in 1861, the Union Army alone had 618 bands and 28,000 musicians joined up. Everybody wanted to be part of the war, but not necessarily everyone.
27,000 were banjo players.
Hey, is there something we can do to take care of this guy? He's kind of interrupting the pace of my show.
I just have to hear a request. He has to talk. Pipe down.
Yeah, like he said. Pipe down.
Go ahead and play. I'm a good old rebel.
Well, I'm trying to explain the music to these people so they'll understand the background and how it affects the music of today. It all joins up.
I think that if you play music, you'll understand music. If you talk about music, that's politics. You know this. You need to go out of town.
Yeah.
Tell me where to go, man. You need to go. Hey, can you play a little tom-tom music? I got a little powwow right there.
Hey, gonna take care of it.
Thank you. Now we can get back to our regularly scheduled program.
I don't even get the William Tell overture. Play on, boys, play on.
Ladies and gentlemen, hey, Tony. Everyone's favorite analog. Getting back to our story, $4 million was set aside to get these 618 bands going. 2 musicians. But musicians were a very important part of the whole scene that day. Can you imagine? A county like this, which was very quiet as it is now, and you have people who, the only thing they really heard that was even close to music might have been sounds of a bird singing, or the wind in the air, or maybe they went to church and they sang in church. But nobody really had the opportunity to hear something like this, a cornet, unless you lived close to a city or a place that manufactured these instruments. So when the military bands came on the scene during the Civil War, it was an absolute rush for all of the young men on both sides. And what's interesting about the music of that day, much of the music was shared by both bands. Of course, there were songs that were familiar and favorites for each side, but the majority of the music they shared. So we just played a tune called Murdoch's Quick Step. That was the tune we just played. A quick step is a equivalent to a polka. It's a fast march. I want to play a tune now for you that would have been familiar back in the time of the Civil War. At that time, there were two national anthems in the United States. There's the one that we're familiar with, our current national anthem. And there was also another one called Hail Columbia. And Hail Columbia is a much older song. It actually was written at the time of George Washington's inauguration as president. And so we would like to play the older version, Hail Columbia. This would have been the equivalent of the national anthem at that time. You can remain seated. Up to that time, most of the music that people were listening to in America came from Europe. In fact, even the folk music of that time came from the Scotch and Irish tradition and Old England. But around the time of the Civil War, American writers like Stephen Foster, for example, began writing our own music. And that music was put into march music, and that's what the soldiers listened to often. They listened to popular music that was placed at a march tempo. The bands of those days were, the regulation band was, I believe, around 26, 28 people. But of course they varied in size. And some of the Confederate bands were smaller and some of the Union bands were bigger. And that mainly had to do with the instruments that were available at that time. I'd like to play a tune for you next. It's called the Civil War Medley. And if you're a son of the South, you'll recognize some of this music. This medley includes the Bonnie Blue Flag and Dixie's Land. And it's kind of interesting about the tune Dixie's Land. When I commissioned this piece for the band, the arranger wasn't too happy to write the tune Dixie. He was concerned that it might offend someone. And in truth, the tune was loved by everybody in the United States at that time. It was quite a popular tune. And it was used by Abraham Lincoln, of all people, as part of his inauguration music. And it was his favorite tune as well. So I view Dixie as America's music, America's tune. So we'll all share it today and hope you enjoy it. This is called the Civil War Medley. The music of the Civil War is pretty simple music. It's really just four-part harmony. And to our ears, it sounds very, almost like a nursery rhyme in some ways. But it was the start. And from the Civil War music, after the end of the Civil War, bandsmen were mustered out, and they formed town bands. And from town bands, the marching movement came on. And then we had John Philip Sousa. And around the turn of the century, we had a change in music again, within a 50-year period, and that's when ragtime and jazz came in. And so, when you trace the lineage of music back to American history, you can arrive here at the Civil War Brass Band. It's 150 years backwards to get there. In a military band of the 1860s, you had basically two types of musicians. You had bandsmen, which were musicians that could read music, and you had field musicians, which were people who generally couldn't read music. The field musicians were the drummers, the fifers, and the buglers. And often, those people were very, very young, too young to carry a rifle. So they were given that task. And everything that happened throughout the day for a soldier was accompanied by music. Getting up in the morning, going to get their food, going to the chapel, going to do any type of a duty that was required or a guard post mount, they were accompanied by a drummer or a fifer. And at the end of the day, they would have a parade, and that would be accompanied by the larger group of bandsmen. I have some instruments that I brought here today that I wanted to show to you and maybe demonstrate for you. See if I can take this off without dropping it. This is a bugle that was made in 1870. It is also known as a signal horn. And people have asked me before after these shows, they say, oh, can you play something on the bugle for me? Well, I wish I could, but the problem with the bugle is it has no valves, it has no slides that move, it has no keys like a saxophone, it has no holes in it like a flute. It just plays 7 notes. It's a signal horn, and the idea behind the bugle is to send signals in code to soldiers in the field to get them to follow orders. So typically, a bugler in the Civil War period would have been a very young man, maybe too young to even carry a weapon. And the chief bugler would have stood next to the commander of the field. The commander would have given an order. The bugler would have played that order. It would have been picked up by another bugler on the field and repeated. So the instrument is very interesting compared to modern instruments. You can see it's red in color, not bright. It's very kind of reddish color. That's because it has a little copper in it. And the purpose of using copper in that day was to make an instrument that could shoot very far, that could travel very far and project. So I'm going to stand. I'm going to hit that wall right there behind us. See if I can, these guys that are putting stuff away, just on the side of these white trucks, I'm going to aim this instrument at those trucks. Is everyone familiar with the charge? What that sounds like on a bugle? Right? Okay, well, the charge of 1862 was very, very different. And it was played generally in the last 100, 200 feet of the run. It wasn't something that was played early on in the assault. It was very seldom heard. But you'll find it interesting because it's very musical. It almost sounds like some sort of a play song. But this is the charge from 1862, and I'm going to bounce it off that brick wall there. You get an idea how this instrument travels. You guys might want to cover your ears. Actually, if you put your hand in front of this thing, you can actually feel the sound waves coming out and hitting your hand. That's how powerful it is. The bugle calls that we use are the same bugle calls that Napoleon used. We adopted all of his bugle calls. Interesting thing about the bugler of the Civil War period is that the Confederate Army and the Union Army used the same bugle calls. So, you can imagine, the fighting unit was 1,000 men. So you got 1,000 men minimum on each side, and you probably have 3 to 4 buglers on each side, all blowing confusing calls, plus horses and cannons and gunfire and shouting. It's amazing anything ever got done in that day. Tom, do you have anything to add to the bugle section?
No, we were just, I guess, talking about the different kinds of bugles. The one you have there. Bugles came in all shapes and sizes, and copper like this, and again, the copper tended to go further. I mean, bugles like this were used to call the troops together for the fall of Richmond in 1865, and that was one of the buglers. We have the story that when he blew assembly to call the troops together for the fall of Richmond, he had tears in his eyes, and he said, "The war is over, all is lost, I'm going home." And as the rest of the troops marched towards Danville, the new Confederate capital, he took his musket and he walked to Hanover County back to his farm, and for him the war was over. And he said, "I hope I never hear a bugle again." Well, that didn't happen, because we've had many wars since, and many bugle calls, and many young men, and nowadays women, dying when they hear bugle calls. And in some places they use bugles like this up through World War II. This wasn't just something with horses and cavalry, but bugles were used. The Japanese used bugles. The Germans, the Americans used bugles in World War II. So these are still in use today in many areas.
I wonder, one of the things I want to talk about today, as well as introduce you to, is, of course, camp music. Everybody was able to sing in that day. It was expected that you would be able to sing. So everyone carried around their voice and sang and whistled. And oftentimes in camp, they would just grab plates or spoons, whatever they could do to create rhythms. And around the same time as the start of the Civil War, the development of the harmonica came out. And immediately, soldiers bought these things and slipped them in their pockets and learned how to play them. So Tom, could you play something on the harmonica that... Okay, I've got one other instrument here I want to show you that's old. This instrument is an actual veteran of the Civil War. This was built in New York, and it was carried by a bandsman with the 8th Kansas Volunteer. And they went through the Cumberland campaign. So this horn, when I got it, was pretty beat up, but it was built by hand in 1861. And it is what's called an E-flat top rotary valve cornet. It's a very interesting design. They really hadn't settled on how they were going to build instruments yet. And the cornet with pistons and valves hadn't quite. There were still some that had keys on them too. They hadn't decided how they'd eventually turn out. I had this horn worked on this year, and it is playable again. So I wanted to let you hear what they would have heard back at the time of the Civil War, because these instruments have a different voice than our modern instruments. As a matter of fact, I always compare them to a human voice. They're not bright and brassy like a modern instrument. They're very, very much like a human voice. I'll try to play a tune here from memory called Lorena.
All right.
From memory. been heard for many, many years. I was fortunate to get a hold of that instrument. I include it in our presentations now every time. Okay, next tune we're going to do is the up-tempo tune.